The dust had not yet settled when the first Spartan fell, not with a heroic last stand, but silently, his shield arm still, raised as if expecting an impact that had already come from the wrong direction. For generations, the heavy footsteps of Spartan hoplites had been the heartbeat of Greek battlefields. 12 deep, sometimes 8. Their phalanx moved like a bronze wave, slow, inevitable, crushing. They did not run. They did not break. They advanced. And when their spears locked, when their shields became a single wall, the enemy always gave way first. That was the mathematics of war as Sparta understood it. Discipline multiplied by terror, divided by nothing. But on the plain of Leuctra, in the summer of 371 BC, the mathematics stopped working. The sun had climbed over the low hills of Boeotia, burning off a mist that clung to the grass like sweat. Two armies faced each other across shallow ground, neither eager, neither willing to blink. On one side, the Spartans under King Cleombrotus, some 10,000 men, including 700 of the Spartan elite, the Spartiates, men who had trained for this moment since the age of 7. On the other, the Thebans, led by a general named Epaminondas, outnumbered but not afraid in the way they should have been. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The Spartan battle plan was predictable because it had always worked. Their best troops, the king and his 300 hippes, bodyguards, would anchor the right flank. The rest of the army would deploy in a standard phalanx, 12 ranks deep, pushing forward in a straight, unstoppable line. The enemy, seeing that formation, would usually fracture before contact. Fear did half the work. But Epaminondas had been watching. He had studied the Spartan way the way a gambler studies a crooked deck, looking not for the trick but for the moment the trick fails. And he had noticed something. The Spartan phalanx had no answer for weight concentrated in the wrong place. It was built for symmetry, for honorable collision, for a fair fight. Epaminondas had no interest in a fair fight. That morning, as the Spartan trumpet sounded the advance, the Theban line did something unexpected. It did not match the Spartan formation shield to shield. Instead, Epaminondas stacked his left flank 50 ranks deep, a column of men, not a line. He stripped his center and right to almost nothing. 8 ranks at most, instructing them not to attack but to delay, to fall back slowly, to absorb pressure without breaking. His plan was not to win a battle of inches. His plan was to annihilate the Spartan. King before the rest of the Spartan army understood what was happening. Cleombrotus saw the Theban left growing thicker, denser, like a storm cloud condensing. Some sources suggest his advisors urged him to redeploy, to shift his own elite troops to counter the weight. But Sparta did not redeploy. Sparta advanced, and so the king gave the order to march forward, into the teeth of something he could not yet see. The ground between the armies was maybe 400 paces, 4 minutes of walking, 2 of jogging, an eternity of silence broken only by the clank of bronze, and the low murmur of men praying to gods, who had stopped listening. The Theban column did not move at first. It waited, and when the Spartans were close enough to see the faces behind the Theban shields, not panicked, not desperate, but strangely calm, Epaminondas gave one command: charge. Not the disciplined advance of a phalanx, a run, a 50-rank deep battering ram of bronze and muscle, hitting the Spartan right flank not as an equal but as an avalanche hits a wall. The impact was heard in the hills. The first rank of Spartan elites did not break. They could not. Their training forbade it, their pride rejected it, and their king was somewhere behind them, watching. But breaking assumes a choice, and the men in that first rank no longer had one. The Theban column hit with such concentrated force that Spartans died standing up, crushed between their own shields and the shields of the men behind them, their breastplates caving inward before their spears had even found a target. This was not combat. This was geometry. A standard phalanx fights in layers. The first 3 ranks engage. The next 9 push and replace casualties. But Epaminondas had given his left flank 50 ranks, 50 men deep, nearly 2,000 hoplites stacked into a single striking fist. When the front rank fell, the second didn't hesitate. The third didn't slow. The 4th, 5th, 6th, they kept coming, stepping over bodies still warm, their spear points finding gaps in the Spartan shield wall that discipline alone could no longer seal. On the Spartan right, King Cleombrotus realized the trap 3 seconds too late. He had expected a traditional battle, push, hold, outlast. Instead, his elite troops were being compressed into a killing zone, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat, unable to do anything except die in formation. Some sources suggest he tried to wheel his cavalry around the Theban flank to relieve the pressure. But the cavalry had already fled, not from cowardice, but from shock. They had never seen Spartans fall backward before. They had never heard Spartans scream. the king made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable the previous day. He ordered his hippies to countercharge into the Theban column. A suicidal move, but Sparta did not retreat. Sparta advanced into the grave. For a few moments, maybe 10, maybe 15 heartbeats, the battle balanced on a blade's edge. The Theban charge slowed as it met the last of the Spartan elite. Men fighting not for victory, but for the only thing they had left. The memory of an unbeaten reputation. Spears shattered. Shields locked at angles never taught in training. Men lost their helmets and kept swinging. The dust rose so thick that soldiers fought blind, stabbing at shadows that might be friends or enemies or neither. And then Cleombrotus fell. No dramatic death speech. No noble last stand captured by historians. Just a Theban spear finding the gap between his cuirass and his thigh. And the king of Sparta dropping to his knees in the mud of Boeotia. Blood already blackening the earth beneath him. His bodyguards tried to drag him clear. But the Theban column kept pressing, kept shoving, kept grinding forward like a millstone that had no intention of stopping until every grain was dust. The king's death was not the end of the battle. It was the beginning of the end. Word spread through the Spartan ranks like fire through dry grass, not shouted, because hoplites didn't shout panic, but whispered in the terrible way that bad news always travels among disciplined men. The king is down. The king is dead. The right flank is gone. And suddenly the Spartan army faced a question no Spartan had ever been trained to answer. What do you do when the thing that always works suddenly doesn't? Some units kept advancing out of sheer muscle memory, marching into a meat grinder that no longer had a front, only a churning mass of bronze and blood. Others tried to hold ground that was already lost, their shield wall buckling under the weight of 50 ranks of Thebans who could smell victory for the first time in a generation, and a very few, began to do the unthinkable. They looked back. The first Spartan to run did not run far. A spear caught him between the shoulder blades before he'd covered 10 paces, and he collapsed face down in the grass. His shield, the sacred symbol of Spartan identity, still strapped to his arm like an anchor, dragging him to the underworld. But others saw him fall, and something strange happened. They kept running anyway. Not all of them. Most of the Spartan army still held, still pushed, still believed that discipline would somehow reverse what had already happened. But on the far left and center, where the Theban line had been deliberately thinned to almost nothing, the Spartan allies, the perioikoi, the free men who were not full citizens, began to waver. They had joined this campaign expecting a quick victory over Thebes, a chance to share in Spartan glory. Instead, they were watching Spartiates die like common soldiers, and the mathematics of self-preservation was finally overtaking the poetry of honor. Epaminondas saw the fracture and did not hesitate. He ordered his center and right, the thin, sacrificial ranks that had spent the last hour falling back, giving ground, absorbing pressure without breaking, to stop retreating and hold. Just hold, do not advance, do not attack, just stand like a wall and make the remaining. Spartans believed that the Theban line was still intact, everywhere except the place where it mattered. Because the place where it mattered, the left flank, the 50-rank column, was already through the Spartan right and curling inward like a closing fist. This was the moment that broke Sparta. Not with a single catastrophic failure, but with 1,000 small ones happening simultaneously. On the Spartan left, far from the king's death, a captain named Isadas, young, arrogant, reportedly naked except for his shield and spear, launched a one-man counterattack against the Theban right. Some sources describe it as heroic. Others call it desperate theater. Either way, he killed several Thebans before being overwhelmed, his body dragged back to Spartan lines by men who should have been advancing, but were instead retreating step by step, shield by shield, hope by hope. On the Spartan center, the phalanx began to lose its shape, not because of cowardice, but because of exhaustion. A hoplite battle is a shoving match, literally. The Greek word othismos means push. For an hour, the Spartans had been pushing against a Theban center that refused to break. A wall of bronze that gave ground just enough to stay alive, but never enough to collapse. And now, with their right flank destroyed and their king dead, the push lost its purpose. Men stopped shoving forward and started shoving sideways, trying to protect their own exposed flanks, trying to survive. A phalanx that tries to survive is already dead. The Theban left, having annihilated the Spartan elite, did not stop to celebrate. They turned, slowly, heavily, like a door swinging on rusted hinges, and began to roll down the length of the Spartan line, hitting each unit in the flank as it came. Flank attacks in hoplite warfare are almost always fatal. A shield wall only works if the threat is in front. When the threat comes from the side, men die with their shields facing the wrong direction. their spears pointing at empty air, their training suddenly useless. By the third hour, the battlefield had become something no Spartan manual had ever described. A rout, not a retreat. Sparta knew how to retreat, how to fall back in good order, how to preserve an army for another day. This was a rout. Men threw away their shields to run faster, a sin so profound in Spartan culture that it carried the death penalty. Men abandoned their wounded. Men crawled into gullies and pressed themselves into the mud, hoping the Thebans would mistake them for corpses. The plain of Leuctra, which had been flat and open that morning, was now littered with the debris of an army that had believed itself invincible until the moment it discovered it was not. And somewhere in the chaos, a surviving Spartan officer gave an order that would echo through Greek history for centuries: sound the retreat. The trumpets blew, the Spartans ran. The retreat from Leuctra was not a march, it was a collapse. Spartan soldiers, men who had been raised on stories of Thermopylae, who had been taught since childhood that the only acceptable outcomes were victory or death, stumbled back toward their camp with empty hands and emptier eyes. Some had lost their shields, some had lost their helmets, some had lost comrades they had trained beside for 20 years. Men who had eaten from the same mess, slept in the same barracks, bled into the same dirt. And now those men lay behind them, stripped by Theban looters before their bodies had cooled, their armor already being fitted to new shoulders. King Cleombrotus's body was recovered by sheer accident. A Spartan soldier recognized the royal crest on a discarded cuirass and dragged the corpse into a cart already piled with wounded. No triumph, no ceremony, just a dead king in a wooden wagon, his blood staining the same boards that carried groaning men with shattered limbs and punctured lungs. Historians debate the exact numbers, but the broad strokes are devastating. Of the 700 Spartan elites who marched onto the plain that morning, perhaps 300 returned. More than 400 Spartiates, full citizens of Sparta, the backbone of the warrior state, lay dead on a battlefield, 70 miles from home. For a city whose entire male citizenry numbered barely 2,000, this was not a defeat. It was an amputation. The Thebans did not pursue immediately. Epaminondas held his men back, not from mercy but from calculation. A pursuit would scatter his formation, turn victory into chaos. And besides, he wanted the Spartans to survive, not as men, but as messengers. He wanted every city in Greece to hear what had happened at Leuctra from the lips of Spartan survivors, because a Spartan admitting defeat was worth more than 1,000 Theban boasts. That night, the two armies camped within sight of each other, separated by a mile of darkening plain and a new geography of grief. On the Theban side, fires burned bright, men sang. Men passed wineskins and told stories of how they had killed Spartans, real Spartans. Not allies, not mercenaries, but the red-cloaked warriors who had terrorized Greece for generations. On the Spartan side, there were almost no fires. Men sat in the dark, listening to the wounded die, waiting for dawn and the reckoning it would bring. The reckoning came in the form of a council of war. Spartan tradition demanded that the surviving officers consult the ephors, the 5 magistrates who ruled Sparta alongside the kings before making any major decision. But the nearest ephor was 3 days' march away, and the army could not stay. The Thebans were already probing the camp's perimeter, testing for weakness. A decision had to be made before sunrise. The debate was bitter. Some officers argued for a counterattack, a desperate, suicidal charge to restore Spartan honor, to prove that Leuctra had been a fluke, a bad day, a temporary madness. Others argued for negotiation, offering terms to Epaminondas, buying time with concessions. And a small, exhausted minority argued for the unthinkable: admit defeat, march home, and face whatever punishment the ephors saw fit to impose. No one argued for retreat. Sparta did not retreat, and yet, as the eastern sky began to gray, the Spartan army did exactly that. They packed their wounded onto carts and their dead onto pyres. They burned what they could not carry, and they marched away from Leuctra not as an army but as a remnant, shields dented, spears broken, the myth of invincibility lying in the mud behind them like a discarded cloak. Behind them, Epaminondas watched from the ridge, saying nothing. He understood what the Spartans did not yet fully grasp. The battle was over, but the war for Greece's future had just begun, and Sparta would never fight the same way again. The news reached Sparta 3 days later, carried not by a single messenger, but by a slow trickle of wounded, men and shell-shocked survivors. And when the ephors heard it, when the numbers were finally spoken aloud, 400 Spartiates dead, the king fallen, the army broken, the city did not weep. Sparta had never taught its citizens how to weep. Instead, Sparta did something stranger. It went silent. Not the silence of grief, but the silence of a machine that has suddenly realized it might be obsolete. For centuries, Spartan power had rested on a single, unspoken assumption that no army could outfight a Spartan army. That assumption had shaped every alliance, every threat, every treaty. It had allowed Sparta to dominate the Peloponnese, to crush Athens in the Peloponnesian War, to dictate terms to Thebes and Corinth and Argos, and now, on a random plain in Boeotia, that assumption had been disproven in a single afternoon. The aftermath was brutal and quiet. Families received the news of their dead with the famous Spartan stoicism: no lamentation, no tearing of clothes, no public mourning. But private grief is harder to measure. Historians note that in the years following Leuctra, Spartan birth rates declined sharply, not because of lost men alone, but because something had broken in the Spartan psyche. Some essential confidence that had once made Spartans believe they were different from other Greeks. They were still different, just no longer better. Epaminondas did not rest on his victory. Over the next decade, he marched into the Peloponnese itself, the Spartan heartland, and did what no Greek general had done in living memory. He liberated the Helots, the enslaved population that had worked Spartan fields for centuries. He built new cities, founded new alliances, and systematically dismantled the infrastructure of Spartan power. By the time he died at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC, Sparta had been reduced from a regional superpower to a second-rate city-state, honored for its past, pitied for its present, feared by no one. But the true legacy of Leuctra was not political or military. It was psychological. The battle proved that Spartan invincibility had always been a story, a useful story. A terrifying story, but a story nonetheless. And once a story is broken, it cannot be repaired. Every Greek city that had ever bent to Sparta's will began to straighten its spine. Every ally that had paid tribute began to calculate new loyalties. Every enemy that had trembled began to dream of revenge. Leuctra did not just defeat an army, it killed an idea. And ideas once dead stay dead. The Spartan survivors who limped home from Boeotia never forgot what they had seen. The 50-rank column, the impossible weight, the feeling of fighting an enemy who had already solved the puzzle before the first spear was thrown. Some of them lived long enough to see Thebes rise and fall, to see Macedon conquer Greece, to see their own city reduced to a tourist attraction for Roman travelers who wanted to gawk at the ruins of a warrior society. They told their children about Leuctra, and their children told their children, and the story became a warning rather than a glory. Because the real lesson of that summer, day in 371 BC, is not about tactics or generalship. It is about the danger of believing your own propaganda. Sparta believed its warriors were unmatched, and that belief, polished over generations, became brittle, a shield that looked unbreakable, until the right hammer struck at the right angle. Epaminondas found that hammer, and on the plain of Leuctra he swung it.